Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today I'm going to be reading you 4 stories from the Haunted Canada book series. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. The Lure of the Falls, Niagara Falls, Ontario. Sometimes a person who's still very much alive haunts a place with his or her disturbing behavior. Francis Abbott, the mysterious young Englishman who came to be known as the Hermit of Niagara, was just such a person. Niagara Falls had already become a famous tourist attraction when Abbott appeared there in June 1829. Visitors from across North America and abroad were coming to marvel at the world wonder they had heard so much about. For many, gazing at the Niagara River racing toward the brink and spilling down into the roaring whirlpool below was and still is almost a hypnotic experience. Perhaps for Abbott it was. Abbott stood out when he first showed up in town on the American side of the falls. Tall and well-built, he punctuated his long strides with a gentleman's walking cane. He wore a long brown cloak that flowed out behind him as he walked, but his feet were bare. Abbott checked into a single room at a small inn with just a few possessions: a bedroll, big book, a soft case like those in which artists carried drawing pads and supplies, and a flute. Planning to stay about a week, Abbott quickly changed his mind. As he explained to the librarian who managed a nearby reading room, he found the combination of the falls' incredible beauty and terrifying power both overwhelming and irresistible. He had traveled widely across Europe, but had never before been so strongly moved by a place. He wanted to experience the falls to the full for at least 6 months, and he wanted to do it alone. Abbott quickly drew up plans for a little cabin. He wanted to build it on one of the Three Sisters small islands in the river above the falls, just south of the much larger Goat Island. The plans included a drawbridge that he could pull up to keep anyone walking around Goat Island at bay. He was refused permission to build on any of the sisters, but Augustus Porter, Goat Island's owner, said he could stay in a small existing log cabin on the big island. Excited, Abbott picked up his flute, a violin he had just bought, and some basic supplies, and headed across the bridge from the U.S. mainland to his new home. Mostly he kept to himself. At times he wouldn't answer when people tried to speak to him, but he wasn't rude or angry, just silent. He played his flute, his violin, and a guitar that he bought later. The haunting strains of his music would drift through the trees until they could no longer be heard. Above the roar of the falls, he composed a little music, and he wrote a lot. According to some people, he wrote only in Latin and threw out anything he'd written as soon as he finished it. He got a cat and a dog and walked with the dog around the island, and whenever the mood struck, and it struck often, he went to the river, getting as close to the rapids and the falls as possible. A narrow bridge jutted out from the southwest corner of Goat Island, linking it to a solid pile of large rocks, known as the Terrapin Rocks. At the end of the bridge, there was a thick section of timber that jutted out beyond the rocks, above the eastern edge of the Horseshoe Falls on the Canadian side of the river. Only the most daring of tourists walked out on that bridge, and they didn't linger there. Under it, the rapids raced toward the edge of the falls, leaving them trembling with fear at the possibility of the bridge collapsing or the rails giving away. That's where Abbott would go to get close to the water. He would walk out on the bridge barefoot, his long hair framing his face. He would cross the bridge and step by step walk out on the wooden beam. Some days he would pace back and forth on it for hours. Occasionally he would stand perfectly still on it, balanced on one foot, or sit on it, his legs swinging over the edge. And sometimes he would go right to the end of the beam, kneel, slip down over the side of it, and holding on with both hands, dangle over the roaring mist, spewing whirlpool underneath the Horseshoe Falls. People on the island and at lookout points on the Canadian side of the falls would cry out in horror, but he seemed to be oblivious to the danger he was in. He once told someone in town that he wasn't doing anything more dangerous than a sailor who climbed high up the rigging of a ship during a storm. He also said he wanted to rid himself of all fear. Abbott eventually had to move out of the cabin on Goat Island, but he didn't leave Niagara. He built himself a hut on the American shore near a fairy island, and every morning, even in the winter when the chunks of ice floating by, he would go to swim in the river. But one June morning in 1831, 2 years after he had come to town, he went swimming 3 times, and the 3rd time he didn't come back. A ferry operator who saw him dive in noticed that he seemed to stay underwater for a long time, but he was used to Abbott's strange behavior. It took him a few minutes to realize that the Englishman had disappeared and to send out a call for a search party. Abbott's body was swept down the river and over the edge into the whirlpool, and there it stayed, day after horrifying day. Rescuers struggled to reach it as crowds peered through the mist to watch its surface briefly before it was sucked back under the swirling eddies. Finally, after 11 days, it was recovered and buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Niagara Falls, New York. At last, Francis Abbott was free of Niagara's spell, but perhaps the falls will never quite be free of Abbotts. A Lonely Soul, Southampton, Ontario. Near the turn of the 20th century, a hermit lived in a rough shack he had built on a small Lake Huron island near Southampton, Ontario. He foraged his food, trapping small game on the island and catching fish offshore from a homemade dugout canoe. Some locals say he'd gone there broken-hearted after a woman he loved rejected him. Others worried that he was mentally ill, but he kept so much of himself that he wouldn't take help from anyone. No one knew how long the unfortunate man had been there, and no one knew his name. Because of the strange cries and howling sounds he made, people usually referred to him as the Wild Man, and nicknamed Bowes Island, where he lived, Wild Man's Island. One day, after a spell of rough weather, some fishermen working their nets spotted the hermit's canoe drifting aimlessly on the lake. Cautiously, they rowed over for a closer look. The boat was empty, the hermit was never seen again, and everyone assumed he had drowned. But every now and then, for several years after he disappeared, someone would hear his haunting cries. The Headless Nun, French Fort Cove, New Brunswick. As British soldiers were forcing Acadians, French settlers living in the maritime provinces, to leave Nova Scotia in 1755, a small group of Acadians living along the Miramichi River east of Chatham, New Brunswick, were getting ready to put up a fight. They set up camp at French Fort Cove, helping the French soldiers stationed there to reinforce the small fort and stockpile food supplies and ammunition. Then, always keeping a watchful lookout, they went about their daily tasks. But possible expulsion by the British wasn't the only threat they had to cope with. Leprosy, a terrible flesh-destroying disease, had infected the community. Those suffering from leprosy had to isolate themselves on a small island nearby. A nun named Sister Marie Inconu worked tirelessly around the cove, nursing the sick, caring for the elderly, and helping pregnant women deliver their babies. Everyone loved her, so she was the one with whom 2 widowed women shared a secret. They told her where they had buried the most valuable possessions of their families and friends, so soldiers couldn't steal them if the British attacked. Unfortunately, both women became ill and died, and somehow word got out that Sister Mary was the only one left who knew where the treasures were hidden. That's why 2 men racked by leprosy attacked her one night as she was crossing the footbridge over a creek running into the cove. Desperate to escape their wretched lives, they were ready to do anything to get enough money to pay a ship's captain to take them far away from the Miramichi. The men grabbed Sister Marie and demanded that she tell them where the valuables were buried. When she refused, they took turns beating her. Still, she said nothing. Finally, one of the crazed pair drew his sword and sliced off her head, before he and his partner ran away, leaving Sister Marie's bleeding corpse on the bridge. He picked up the head and threw it into the creek. It was never found. Out of respect for her, the French soldiers garrisoned at a small fort eventually arranged for Sister Marie's remains to be shipped to France so she could be buried beside other members of her family. but it said that without her head she could never find peace there, and that her spirit had stayed behind in Acadia to search for it. Her gruesome decapitated apparition has been frightening people around French Fort Cove, especially would-be treasure hunters, for 200 years. As long as the guards are hiding in place, it's unlikely that the secret stash of valuables belonging to the French fort settlers will ever be found. The Headless Sea Captain, St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. The year was 1745. The place was St. John's, Newfoundland. The location was a house that a beautiful young woman had called home some years before a man named Samuel Pettyham started renting it. Add betrayal and jealousy, and the stage is set for a tale of terror recorded more than 250 years ago, and passed down from generation to generation ever since. Pettyham hadn't been living in the house long before he started feeling a little uncomfortable there. What spooked him most was the way the latches on the front and back doors kept lifting mysteriously at night. When he'd fling open the doors to see who was trying to get in, there'd be no one outside. Pettyham found the latch lifting disturbing, but not enough to make him want to move. Instead, he just made sure every evening that both doors were bolted as well as latched. But one night, something happened that nearly scared him to death. He was coming home from a friend's place when he noticed a strange glow ahead. As he got closer, he saw what looked like the silhouette of a person standing at the end of the street near his front door. Could this be the culprit who'd been trying to get into the house? Pettyham took a few more steps, then froze, petrified. Now he could see that the tall figure before him was a man with no head. Pettyham bolted back up the street and round the first corner. Trembling, he pounded on the door of a nearby rooming house and begged to be let in. The owner did let him in and managed to calm him down enough to find out what had happened. Only then did Pettyham learn of the beautiful woman who used to live in that house, and of the two men who had loved her. One had been a neighbor, the other a tall, handsome English sea captain, who would visit her whenever he docked his ship in St. John's Harbor. Eventually the neighbor had found out about the captain's late-night visits to the woman he thought was his sweetheart. One evening when the captain's ship was in port, he went to his girlfriend's house, and seething with jealousy and rage, he waited in the shadows watching the front door. The moment the captain stepped out of the house into the moonlight, the stalker rushed forward wielding a razor-sharp sword. One furious swing was all it took. Seconds later, the captain lay dead in street, his bloody head close by. According to the owner of the boarding house, Pettyham had just seen the sea captain's ghost. Others in the neighborhood had seen it before, and still others would see it again. The murderer was never caught, so perhaps the captain's spirit kept returning to the scene of the crime to find him. Whatever the reason, the night in 1745, Samuel Pettyham had no intention of returning home to the specter of the headless captain and going to bed. He rented a room where he was and spent the rest of the worst night of his life there. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.